You're going to check it. Is it on? Testing, testing. Bring that other one over here.
It's 15. I'm not sure it'll work 15. That's what I thought.
Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Get up to it.
Okay. It's on. You're just going to need to really get up to it.
And we could use, oh, that sounds better. That's good. Okay, y'all. Take your seats, please. Okay, let's get started. Welcome to another year of Summer Club. I'm Judy Shuford. I've been involved with Summer Club for a while, and yeah, a little while. And I suspect that there are many of you who watched your mothers or your grandmothers go to the Montreat Women's Club. And our organization, this is the 114th year of this club. It's changed names. They allowed men in. But we're still the same organization, and we take it very seriously that we keep that going. So let's keep remembering to come to Summer Club. The purpose, let me say, for Summer Club is to provide entertaining and informative program and a meeting place for all adult Montreaters. Now, we don't run the kids off, but life is not planned around the kids. This is around us. So we have a wonderful lineup of programs. We do every year, but we do again this year. With Dave Fleming, who's here, and he will be laying out his meticulous research on the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, now known as MECDEC, and why May the 20th, 1775 is on our North Carolina flag. And he'll tell us more about how he got started with this. Next week, we have a very informative program. If you know Wright McCallum, you know that she is always really, really good. And she will be talking about the Scots-Irish. And I think there's a real connection here, because I bet you he'll probably have something to say about that, because the signers were primarily Scots-Irish. I have your book, so. And so that would be a really good follow-up. And then the following week, on July the 23rd, will feature a very big deal of a person in the music industry who just happened to be a really good friend of Rusty and Betty Douglas. And that's how he is coming over. He gets to eat Betty Douglas's food. So that seems like a good exchange. But Gary Overton, though we might not necessarily know that name, he has been involved with practically every name you can think of, certainly in the country music world. Garth Brooks, Carrie Underwood, Alan Jackson, Reba McEntire, and many, many more. So thanks to Rusty for getting that done for us. The last event will be our covered dish picnic, which will be on August the 6th at Gaither Fellowship. And we'll enjoy an old-fashioned Montreat sing-along that will be led by our famous Montreat musical group called the Rock Hoppers. You may have heard them playing at the Presbyterian Heritage Center. Okay, so Summer Club also, even though it says Summer Club, also sponsors other events. We've already had the annual Daffodil Party, and that is held at Margot and Tyler Smith's house. And it's everybody known to man just shows up. Sometimes you wear yellow, and sometime when we have time, I'll tell you why we wear yellow and how that involved Kitty Fouché way back when she fell into an oyster bed, but whatever. Anyway, so we adopted that event. It was such a good welcome home to Kitty when she came back from this unfortunate happening that we liked it so much. We just said, well, let's just do this every year. So we do this every year. And Summer Club, who will sponsor anything we like that's good, took that up. And then in December, we had our first, and it will become our annual gate lighting event in December to welcome in the Christmas season. And that involved a lot of Montreat kids. So if you didn't go last year, plan on attending this year when we get the date and everything is settled. That was fun, and it was really great to see so many young people. I bet you didn't know we had so many young people in Montreat. We do. And I also want to thank our beautiful table makers back there, the refreshment people under Beth Frith and her trusty team. It looks beautiful back there. And as you know, we're sort of famous for our refreshments at Summer Club. And thanks to Ellen Dean she will be having our people to welcome you, our greeters, every week. So we appreciate all the help we get. Okay, so let's start. Oh, well, let me have a couple of announcements though before. You've probably seen the good publicity that's coming out on the Presbyterian Heritage Center's ice cream social. Here we go. We have members of the committee here, and I know year before last, there were 400 and something people who ate homemade ice cream that day. It will be Saturday, July the 19th from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And then the other thing that Lila Ray wanted me to tell you about, she brought some of the brochures from the Heritage Center on 8 historic churches in old Mecklenburg County. So I'm sure Dave will find this one interesting. And the original paintings of those churches are in the Heritage Center. But those churches were alive and well during the time that he's going to be talking to you about it. So those 2 things. Now, let's get to, let's have our devotional first. So our devotional will be given today by someone most of you know and love, Rusty Douglas.
I wanted this devotional today to connect with our speaker's topic. I read David Fleming's book a couple of years ago. Dick and Lila Ray put me onto it. I was born in Mecklenburg County, went to John McKnight Alexander Junior High School, and he was one of the main signers and prime movers behind that document, which I take to be authentic. And it reminds those New England Yankees that they were not the only patriots in this country in the 1770s. So for this devotional, I thought I would give you in a nutshell what Eric Metaxas is saying in his book, If You Can Keep It. It's a New York Times bestseller. It was out several years ago. And this book is also about the founding of this country and the promise of American liberty. It goes back to those 100 days in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, when some of the most brilliant men of any generation crafted a constitution for a new country, the United States of America. Washington, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton were there drafting a promissory note to which every American would be an heir. The title of the book, If You Can Keep It, comes from a story told by James McHenry, a delegate to the convention. As he exited Independence Hall one day with Ben Franklin, a woman had a question for Franklin. She came up to him and said, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" And Franklin shot back, "A republic, madam, if we can keep it." There it was, a republic, a government where the power was located with the people and their elected representatives. Metaxas says this experiment in liberty called America was and remains a genuinely wild idea. And if we are to keep it, we must grasp what it is and how it works. In 1776, a nation was formed in a way that no nation had ever been formed in history. A nation formed not by king or dictator, a nation put together not by ethnicity or tribes. They were all Americans who voluntarily believed in liberty. The founders believed, as good Presbyterians, that humankind had fallen, and so they knew they had to limit the power of any one part of the government, and so they built in all those checks and balances. The second thing they believed in, says Metaxas, a secret ingredient was religion. Religion that was truly free, not coerced. They believed that self-government could not work without religious people governing themselves. The founders knew that at a deep level, freedom and religion went together. They sustained each other. They recognized that if you take faith in God and morality out of the equation, everything will fall apart. Here's what they believe, Metaxas says. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith. Faith requires freedom. Each supports the other like a three-legged stool. And of course, if you knock out one leg, the stool falls. Ben Franklin said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. So from the outset, the founders realized that for self-government to work, morality, faith in God, and religion were necessary for success. And where were these virtues to come from? From faith in God and obedience to God. They knew that the Constitution and the laws alone were insufficient to create a moral people. That required faith in God. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith. Faith requires freedom. And for America to succeed, it needed virtuous people who would put the country's needs before their own individual needs. But we won't have a virtuous people, Metaxas says, and the founders said, without God, faith, and morality. In closing, my friends, we have been bequeathed the freest and most prosperous nation in the history of the world, built on freedom, virtue, and faith. There's no guarantee it will be here 50 or 100 years from now. It's a wild experiment for sure. And I, for one, hope that with God's blessing, we can keep it. Let us pray. Gracious God, by your good providence, you brought this nation into being through great struggle and sacrifice. You have richly blessed us as a nation and made us to enjoy freedom and liberty, the likes of which most nations never taste. Thank you for those patriots who went before us and bequeathed to us such a great gift. May we steward this gift well and pass it along to those who come after us. Through Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Rusty. You always inspire us and make us think. So let's talk about a little Dave Fleming. Let me say, I think we're most fortunate to be able to have him with us. He has been with ESPN writing as a senior writer now, and 3 decades, also Sports Illustrated and many other places that his prolific writing has occurred. He's known for his keen sense of humor, and those of you who have read his book, Who's Your Founding Father, know that. He has a great sense of humor, makes reading very easy. By the way, afterwards, there will be books here to be bought, and he's autographing. A number of you have already bought them before the program. I first heard about Dave and his quest to unravel the controversy of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence from, as Rusty mentioned, Lila and Dick Ray. And Lila is here. She was right there. She's moved. Now she's right here. And in her earlier days, she got her master's thesis on Reverend Alexander Craighead. And Dave, in doing his thorough research, came across her name and pursued that. And he happened to have worked at ESPN with a woman named McGahee. And he put that together and found a way to call Lila. And then he came over and spent the day with Lila and Dick Ray and interviewed both because Dick was, as you know, the long time only chairman we had of the Presbyterian Heritage Center. So he had a keen interest in what his wife was doing. And so that is the connection. And there's more I could tell you on Craighead that Lila and I share. That's another story, another time too. But the point is, he saw the flag. And have you noticed the flag and the date that's on it? And what is the background on that? Why is it there? And why do all the people still celebrate that? And one of the things that I particularly noticed was the number of people that have followed this. So in 1775 is when the signing of the Meck Deck was. In 1875, 40,000 people traveled to Charlotte, Mecklenburg, when Charlotte had a population of 6,000. Those people believed that the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence happened. So we get a chance now, and you'll get to decide today, when you listen to him, if his research convinces you that it happened. So let's hear what he has to say. Thank you for coming.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. Wow, what a great crowd. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I think we're going to do just a quick, John, do you want to do the video? Let's do the video now, if we can. I think this helps give a little bit of an idea, context of the MEC deck and sort of what's going on, especially this. Oh, I put him on the spot. Sorry about that. Okay. Yes. Oh.
And the other thing we thought we knew about the coming of our nation is sort of a one story that it's great to do that great historic importance to explore and to uncover just a kind of almost forgotten history. As somebody who is here who's a citizen of the city, it's something that I take great pride that we live in we live in the cradle of American independence. The story of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence begins on May 19th, when 26 local Scotch-Irish Presbyterian militia leaders are meeting at the bar court in secret in Street. When they received word from a writer that the Battle of Lexington Concord occurred exactly 1 month before, and then to go towards and there's a series of 24 hours of debate and resolve on a series of resolutions that we now know as the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. And they proclaim themselves quote, free and independent, quote, of Great Britain. And this is the first Declaration of Independence in the American colony. Thomas Polk read that right at the county courthouse at Trinity trial. They read the Declaration and people got very excited to the they did it 14 months before Congress. That's a big important decision because when the men of Charlotte, the messengers we call them, when people take it here, I'm not saying it was way more fast. It was really more, it was really more real risking. It's an urban legend and there's a great body of evidence that it's true. However, the papers, the original papers are gone and they'll never be found. So no one can conclusively point to one piece of paper and say, this is the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. And thus there's a controversy about whether it's real, whether it's something of a hoax, whether it's an inflated story by various eyewitnesses 50 years later. And the historians are on both sides are not fully satisfied, which is part of the fun of the story, frankly.
I am descendant of the Alexanders. Several of them were signers of the original Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. We have actually a commitment to share this history. There is an idea that Charlotte doesn't have history, but the story is there and the history is so rich. It's over 250 years old. And this is our opportunity to let people know that we have it and that we're proud of it and it deserves to be heard.
MECDEC demonstrates what I think is, it epitomizes the spirit of Charlotte and its early settlers.
The May 20 Society is a local nonprofit organization which commemorates the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. So we started this group 25 years ago for purposes of sort of revitalizing this local commemoration that had largely been forgotten.
The May 20th Society, their role has been critical. You know, because of apathy, whether it was sort of from a civic leader or just citizenship, the MECDEC was dying. It was sort of becoming a folktale. It was being forgotten. And that's the May 20th Society really rescued it from obscurity and built it back into what it is now, which is, I think it's going to be a national sensation and a sort of thing of great regional pride. We're getting ready to celebrate the 250th anniversary, the semi-quincentennial celebration of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence on May 20th, 2025.
we used to have huge parades. In fact, I have an 1886 newspaper that John Belk gave me, just the front page, that had a picture of the huge parade that they had going up and down Trade Street and Tryon. And we had 5 presidents came here and led those parades. It's so exciting.
In 1954, President Eisenhower came to Charlotte. 1975, the 200th anniversary of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, President Ford came for that celebration. And both of those 2 events were at Freedom Park. My father organized and led both of the efforts to hold the celebrations at Freedom Park and hosted President Eisenhower, hosted President Ford.
I hope that for the 250th celebration, we get the president or vice presidents. I hope we have ticker tape parades and fireworks and the whole 9 yards. You know, that's how we used to celebrate it here in Charlotte. And I think it's worthy of that celebration every year, but certainly for our 250th anniversary.
The 250th anniversary of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence is a generational opportunity to put a light back on this important local commemoration.
I mean, for me, the ultimate for this would be if we could get back to that, not just because it's proper to honor the men who were brave enough to first declare it, but because this is something that could be, you know, a calling card for Charlotte, could be important for North Carolina. It should be a celebration. It should be a party. Like that's what I want to be a part of MECTEC Palooza 250 and beyond. Perfect. So one of the reasons I'm so glad to be here with everybody today is Montreat and Lila was the very first step in the entire process of the research and writing of this book. And this turns out to be, I think for now, probably my last book event now that we've celebrated the 250th. So it's a really nice bookend for me. And I will talk much more about Lila and her really important role in the book and sort of getting it off the ground. But I remember distinctly being on her porch, and we were both daydreaming about the book. I had just begun to research it. So the idea that the book would be done and printed and actually published was so far down the road, we could barely imagine it. And we both we made a promise. I said, when the book comes out, I will come back and do an event or speak to a book club, or I will be back. And so I guess it's been 3 years, but it's nice to sort of complete that promise. So it was very nice to see you, Lila, again, and to be here. I think Judy's great introduction, and thank you really for all your work and for just what has been just a perfect planning, just an easy event. I really appreciate the attention. I think usually the first question most people have for me is, how does somebody who spent 30 years as a writer at Sports Illustrated and then ESPN, how does somebody like that get involved in American history, especially this strange, interesting wrinkle? And I don't know if you've noticed, but my little shirt has the North Carolina symbol on it. And so I usually start these talks with my youngest daughter, Kate, who is about to start her senior year in Chapel Hill. It was Kate who was late and still on the playground at Davidson Elementary, where my wife Kim and I moved to the Charlotte area and then built a house in Davidson, sight unseen. I had been to Charlotte covering the Panthers and the Hornets and stuff like that, but we didn't know that was about the extent of what we knew about Charlotte and North Carolina. We moved to Charlotte sight unseen and settled in Davidson. And it was when Kate, so this would have been at least 10 years ago, Kate was still on the playground when I went to pick her up. So I was waiting in the lobby of Davidson Elementary, and with nothing else to do, I glanced over and looked at the North Carolina flag that was hanging in the lobby of the school. And I noticed the date, May 20th, 1775, on the top of the flag. Now, at Sports Illustrated, and then especially at ESPN, I had carved out, the niche that I had carved out for myself was not, I was not sort of a Tom Brady, Michael Jordan type of writer. I did stuff that was just barely tangentially related to sports. And the stranger and the more interesting and the more unique and the weirder, the better. So I had spent an entire career looking for these stranger than fiction stories that I could bring to life in the magazine. So I've been all over the globe doing stories on things like Bigfoot calling and lightsaber dueling and Steph Curry's, the original rickety basketball hoop that Steph Curry learned to shoot on, and hockey dentists. And I just did a story a couple of years ago. Yes, see, okay. That's always a good sign that I'm in the right place when people laugh about that. Okay, so you get it. So imagine somebody like that who those stories are always on my radar. And I'm sitting there in the lobby of Kate's school, and I noticed that the date on the North Carolina state flag is 14 months before we even declared independence as a country. And sometimes you have to be careful with this line of work because, you know, I asked that one question and, 13 years later, here we are. So I've been down that rabbit hole for a long time because as soon as I Googled what that date represented, the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, and the idea that Charlotte and Mecklenburg County and North Carolina is the actual true cradle of American independence, that story, again, for somebody who's in constant search of these kinds of stories, immediately the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew I had landed on something. And as a writer, as an author, the next big question is, oh, please, please don't let anyone else have written a book yet about this topic. And so when I realized that the story was hard to believe and stranger than fiction and just this incredibly wild adventure, and that nobody had written a book yet, I thought, I went to my agent in New York and I said, I've got the idea for my next book. And I think she was expecting, again, NFL, Super Bowl, something big. And when I said, oh, it's a little wrinkle of American history about the first true Declaration of Independence, she kind of went, what? So after I convinced my agent, and I think the interest in the story, it's so strange and so out of the ordinary, and all the different sort of wrinkles, it sold fairly quickly. But I wasn't sure exactly the direction I was going to take with the book. I'm not a historian, and I didn't want to sort of write or read a dry history book. And so I just continued to do research and obsess over this incredible story until I figured out from an editor that I could just write it the way I write all my other stories, sort of as an adventure, as a travel log, with a sense of humor. And I definitely began as a skeptic, and the book was going to be much more tongue-in-cheek, sort of like get a load of what they think they did in North Carolina. These crazy people think that they declared independence first. And then a weird thing happened. I started to do the research. And the minute that I dug into the research, I understood that although the original document burned, the corroborating evidence of the MEC deck is overwhelming and irrefutable. And that is why people like Ken Burns and David McCullough and Cokie Roberts and Andrew Roberts and the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court are all advocates and believers in the MEC deck. And suddenly, so was I. But for me, the book didn't really take shape until I understood. I went to Boston, I went to Quincy, Massachusetts, where John Adams, his library, his burial, and his home site are. And I found letters back and forth between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson discussing the MEC deck. And that's when I knew. Most people understand that they had a complicated relationship. In the book, I call them frenemies. They were sort of rivals, and they were colleagues, and they worked together on the Declaration, but they had very, very different personalities. And I think Adams grew to resent the attention that Jefferson was sort of vacuuming up once everybody decided that the Declaration of Independence was this incredible document. And the MEC deck, though, comes to life when you realize, okay, this isn't some folk tale. This isn't some hoax. There, you can hold the letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, two icons of American history, of world history, as they argue back and forth about the MEC deck. It's incredible. It's breathtaking. And that's when I knew, because Adams really, and again, if you think the rhetoric of today's politics is bad, you should read these letters, or you should listen to the rhetoric back and forth between Adams' followers and Jefferson's followers when Jefferson won the presidency, when John Adams thought he was sort of entitled to a second term. It's incredible, and it will set you at ease because it's far more worse than anything we're sort of hearing today. And you understand sort of the cyclical nature and the sort of argumentative and rhetorical nature of a healthy democracy is people arguing and sort of bitterly taking their sides. And it can get out of control, but that was sort of reassuring for me researching this. So now I've got the book deal. I know that there's something to this because of the Adams and Jefferson letters. And there was a perfect storm that happened in Charlotte in 1775, whether it's the context of what was going on, the Scots-Irish Presbyterians who populated Mecklenburg, the religious aspect of that, and sort of the timing of when this meeting occurred, exactly the same day when news of Lexington and Concord arrived in Charlotte. So, but at the heart of this was a preacher, a Presbyterian minister, reverend, by the name of Alexander Craighead. And after the Adams letters, if you're studying the MEC deck and you're not a historian, you know that you can't move forward with the story without a complete, thorough understanding of Alexander Craighead and of sort of how his doctrine of sort of fighting against tyranny on earth is the highest form of obedience to God. How that really, he was the spiritual leader of what eventually became the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. So imagine here I am, I'm already nervous because I'm a sports writer, I'm not a historian, and I say, okay, here's the building block to start this book on. I need to find out everything I can about Alexander Craighead. And what happens is I start to look for information, and there is not a lot. And I find a mention over and over again of this incredible thesis paper that was written, let's see, back in the 80s, I think. 2000s? 2000, okay. This won't be the first time Lila corrects me. So the problem is, everybody I talk to says this thesis paper, it's incredibly well-researched, it's thorough, it gives you insights into him and whether he was either sort of the spiritual father of American independence or maybe a little bit wacky, and all that he had been through, especially the sort of how the Scots-Irish Presbyterians especially navigated from the lowlands in Scotland to the Ulster Plantation in Northern Ireland, to Philadelphia, across Pennsylvania, and then all the way down to Carolina, basically to get away from generational tyranny from the crown that their families had suffered. So obviously Craighead, knowing everything about Craighead is a key. I can't find the thesis. I call different colleges, I call different libraries, I call friends and authors and historians and everybody, and everybody has heard of it and thinks they know where it is, but nobody can find it. And now this part of the book is coming due. And now I'm in full-blown panic mode because now it's like all the doubts are coming in. It's like, you never should have done this. You're not a historian. You're not a researcher. You can't do it. And then I notice that the woman who wrote this incredible thesis, her maiden name is McGahey, which is not a common name, especially the pronunciation. And as I'm panicking, I remember that I had an office at Sports Illustrated in New York when I started there as a fact checker, right across the hallway from another Sports Illustrated reporter, a woman whose name then was Ashley McGahey. And we used to tease her when we were mad at her, we would pronounce her name McGeechee, just to get her mad. So I learned the proper pronunciation of that name. And I thought, well, and I knew she had connections to North Carolina. So in desperation, I had not talked to her in 20 years probably, but I still had her contact information. So I texted Ashley and I said, this is crazy. It's Flem. Remember me from Sports Illustrated. I have the craziest question to ask you. I'm doing this history book on the Mecklenburg Declaration. I need this thesis. It was written by a McGahey. Do you happen to have any chance know Lila McGahey Ray? And, you know, you send a text like that and you're like, she's going to think I'm crazy or, you know, or think it's a prank text or something like that. And she texts back just a brief text right back that said, that's my aunt. And I still remember, I mean, and that's why that's why I'm here today, because that was the beginning for me. That lucky break that you get that sort of sends you off on this adventure. And that one text was, she was like, that's my aunt. But the story gets even crazier because then I said, do you know if she has a copy of her, of the thesis that she wrote about Alexander Craighead? And, you know, you're waiting, you see the dots. And she said, Ashley wrote me back and said, you live in Davidson, don't you? And I said, yep. And she goes, my aunt lives 3 blocks from you. And she is on her porch right now with a copy of the thesis if you want to walk down and pick up the thesis from her. Yeah, I mean, that is one of those where you're like, okay, now we've got something. And here's the second best part. By the time I got to Elizabeth, right? Elizabeth, by the time I got to her house, she was waiting with the thesis and the most delicious gin and tonic I've ever had in my entire life. And I thought, oh, this book writing's easy. This is super easy. So I read the thesis. I did my homework. I devoured it. It was one of those things where we've all had textbooks where you're supposed to highlight it. And I basically just highlighted the entire thing. And then I reached out to Lila, and of course, she was so gracious and said, yes, please come up. I wanted to come up and visit the Heritage Center and then to talk to the author herself. And we spent the day discussing Craighead and putting the sort of spiritual aspect of the Mech Deck and this quest for freedom and independence in context. We had a lovely lunch on your porch. I left that day thinking, I can do this. I can do this. And I want to share one section of the book that I particularly like, that it explains part of that relationship. Before we go any further, I should pause for a second to share the story behind where a lot of this Craighead information comes from. The comprehensive history of Craighead's Sugar Creek Presbyterian Church was written in 1954 by Neil Roderick McGahey, who served as the Sugar Creek pastor from 1941 to 1945, before moving to a larger church about an hour north in Statesville. The McGahee name, pronounced McGahee, may sound familiar to some older diehard ACC hoops fans. His son, Neil McGahee Jr., coached the Duke basketball team for a single season in 1973-74. Neil Jr. and his sisters, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Lila, grew up riding their bikes around the dusty red clay Sugar Creek property, where their father spoke of Craighead so often and with such reverence that until adulthood, they were all convinced they were somehow kin to Craighead. Neil Sr. died in 1979, and when his wife Frances passed away in 1998, Lila, while going through their belongings, came across a heavy box full of research marked Craighead. It was clear from the content that her father had always dreamed of turning that box into a book or even a novel. The research included a stunning find, copies of Craighead's sermons printed by Benjamin Franklin. Lila and her husband, Richard Ray, whom I quoted extensively at the beginning of this chapter, were about to move to Pennsylvania so that Dick could teach and study at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. In her 60s at the time, Lila decided, what the heck? I'll use my time on campus to get a master's degree. She already had the topic of her thesis picked out. And 2 years later, in 2001, Lila published the 130-page, exhaustively researched thesis titled Alexander Craighead with Drawn Sword. And I love that title because it captures Craighead fully, because sometimes he would preach with the Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. That is how much he combined religion and revolution. In a crazy twist, sorry, you guys have already heard this part. In a crazy twist, Lila's niece turned out to be a former colleague of mine at SI and ESPN. So less than 24 hours after wondering how in the world I would ever find a copy of this obscure thesis, I was on the phone with Lila making plans to spend the day at her home in the Blue Ridge Mountains discussing all things Alexander Craighead over chicken salad, sandwiches, and sweet tea. A week later, I was on her screened-in porch, about to dig in, when Dick bowed his head in prayer. He blessed me, my book, the MECDEC Patriots, and especially the scholar at the table, the remarkable woman he had met while lifeguarding almost 70 years before at a lake just down the street, who was a, quote, true spiritual descendant of Alexander Craighead. I thought this was about the most romantic thing I'd ever heard, but it was nothing for these two. Lila has trouble reading because of a worsening eye condition. So to prepare for my visit, Dick reread her thesis to her a few pages at a time every night before they went to bed. According to Lila then, in 1735, when Alexander was given his own church near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he picked up exactly where his own father had left off. There's no way I could have come here and talked to you without reading that part of the book. Because in writing a book, in publicizing a book, in editing a book, there's so many people that help you and boost you along the way. And again, like I said, I left that day and drove back to Davidson with a renewed sort of spirit that I could do this, that I could uncover obscure things, and the book just sort of, the rest of the process just sort of, it just sort of burst out from there. And I realized that what was going to make the book work was it was going to be an adventure. It needed to be sort of calling in favors and traveling to the mountains and going through obscure archives and all that different stuff. And that was going to be, that attitude and tone was what was going to make this book different than other history books. And Lila really provided that spark. So I'm always indebted to her and to Dick. I'll tell you another great story about the magic of creating a book. When we were here, we went to the Heritage Center. And in 1831, the state of North Carolina, led by the governor, produced a pamphlet of all the evidence and all the testimony about the that would authenticate and corroborate the mech deck. And then they printed it up in I forget, it's like 15,000 words. It's got 13 eyewitnesses. The foreword, in the foreword, the governor says, nothing about the Revolutionary War has been as well documented as the mech deck, and enjoy all this evidence. But I had never seen an actual original copy. I had seen printed copies and different things like that. We were at the Heritage Center, and the archivist there, the researcher there, was grabbing some old books about Craighead and about Presbyterians and Scots-Irish and the Richard Cameron and the Covenanters and all that stuff, just for background. And one of the books that she brought to the table, she had opened it up, and an original copy of that 1831 investigation fell out between the pages. And I don't think either one of us knew that it was original until she had copied it and sent it to me. And I was like, I think you have this is a treasure that's just fallen out between pages. And I always think someday, especially with the attention that the mech deck's getting in the 250th anniversary, that's what's going to happen. Someone is going to open a family Bible, maybe one of the Alexanders, you never know, that's up in their attic, or they're going to be clearing out something, and another original copy of the mech deck is going to fall out of somebody's family diary or Bible or something like that. But we know Craighead was the spiritual father of the mech deck, and we know it's important to put into context. When you understand the context of what was going on in 1775 in Mecklenburg County in North Carolina and who it was happening to, the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, as we said, had been essentially lured and kicked out of the lowlands, moved to the Ulster plantation in Northern Ireland because the king was trying to fix his Irish problem by colonizing Northern Ireland with Scots. But then, of course, went back on all of his promises. And again, they couldn't hold office because they weren't part of the Anglican Church. They couldn't, all their wool was taxed. And so they, in no time at all, they had no choice but to flee to America across the ocean. Some people believe up to 500,000 of them came to America during the middle part of that century. One author said that these Scots-Irish didn't just come to America, they became America. And if you look at, they come into Pennsylvania, they're looking for land and freedom and independence. And they move west through Pennsylvania, and then they come all the way down to Carolina, looking to get away from the tyranny of the king. And when they get to Carolina, what do they get hit with? The Stamp Act, taxes on rum and rye, which I think was the last step for many of them, the last straw for many of them. And then for me, I think the straw that broke the camel's back was the king then promised them that they could have a college charter in Charlotte, and then went back on his word. And then they hit them with the Marriage and Vestry Act. And this was essentially, the main part of this act was, if you were not married in the Anglican Church approved by the king, then your children would not be recognized as legitimate by the crown. And that doesn't sound like a lot until you understand what that means is generations have come through 3 countries and across an ocean and come to Charlotte, and they've carved out a piece of the wilderness for themselves. But because of the Marriage and Vestry Act, their children can't inherit it because they weren't legitimately married. And then on top of that, what the king was saying was your children are condemned to hell as well for all eternity. And when you understand that, almost everything else about the sort of controversy fades away, because you think what happened was the Scots-Irish Presbyterians in Mecklenburg in 1775 recognized long before anyone else, because of what their families had been through, that it was not going to get better. And they, because of their spirit and because of their indoctrination from Craighead, they were like, well, let's just get it over with. Let's put it in writing. Let's stand up and be honest about it. Let's put it in writing and let's just get on with it, because we know the king's tricks. We know the crown's tricks. We're just going to declare ourselves independent and either start fighting or just start living our lives as free and independent men. And when you understand that and you understand the context, it would have been much more surprising had these Scots-Irish Presbyterians not declared independence. If they had just sat on their hands and bitten their tongues and just sort of tolerated this tyranny that their families had been subjected to for generations, it makes much more sense that they would go ahead and declare it. And so that's what happens is another myth that's associated with the declaration, the MECDEC, is that what would these frontiersmen, what would these farmers, what would these sort of not well-educated backcountrymen, what would they know about high concepts such as freedom and independence and individualism? Well, it turns out that several of them were Princeton graduates. And that just, the MECDEC is really one of the first things that suffers from misinformation. I think if you tell enough people over and over again that these farmers didn't know what they were talking about, it becomes fact. But all you have to do is just 5 minutes of research and you understand that a lot of these men went to Princeton, studied at Princeton, were Princeton scholars, and in the 1770s met at a spring on McNitt Alexander's property, where this is another part of the story I love. They met by this spring that became known as Freedom Spring to discuss, would they declare independence? If they did, what would it look like? What would it need to say? As they're being taxed, all these things are going on. The frontier is in open rebellion, and they meet on McNitt's property at this Freedom Spring, which also turns out to be where his whiskey still was. So I love the fact that the first men to really seriously consider declaring independence basically did it as a way to hide in the woods and drink whiskey and brandy. But so these men had been discussing what if. McNitt and Thomas Polk then, who was one of the founders of Charlotte, they call for a meeting in Charlotte on May 19th of 2 representatives from each militia squad throughout Mecklenburg County. These men show up on May 19th, and they haven't decided already to declare independence. They get there on May 19th, and that is when we talked about a perfect storm. That is when word from a rider on horseback, that's when word finally arrives in Charlotte about the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord. And that's the spark that then ignites these men who have already met and have already been debating it. They decide, that's it, we're going to declare independence. And so they send a subcommittee down to, which was called Liberty Hall College, to write up the phrases that they had already been contemplating at the spring. And the big part of that, the document is brief, it's economic, but it's also strong and soaring, and sort of there isn't a wasted word in the MECDEC. And free and independent is really what everyone focuses on. But right after that is the last part of the MECDEC it's a paragraph that I always like to bring up, because it talks about, now that we have all these men, some Princeton scholars, some farmers, some rich, some poor, some Scots-Irish, some German, different religions, Anglican Church, now that we've sworn to be free and independent, we are bound to each other now. And I always think that part of the MECDEC gets less attention, But to me, it was really the first true declaration or definition of American patriotism, that we are all different. But because of this oath that we've just taken to declare independence, we now are all bound together for the greater good. So I always like to mention that. I have one or two more stories to tell, and then I will answer questions, or we can treat this like a book club too, if you guys have things that you want to discuss or whatever. But there are a few more things that I want to talk about this adventure. What happens is then, so the mech deck, there's all this corroborating evidence. The mech deck, as many things in this time frame, it's at McNitt's farm. Hezekiah, you're actually a descendant of Hezekiah. Okay, so here's my one criticism of the mech deck signers and the Alexanders. McNitt lived in Huntersville in this huge wooden estate house. And, oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Hezekiah lived in a house built of rocks that still stands in Charlotte. It's the oldest structure still standing in Mecklenburg County, I think. They stored the mech deck in the house that would burn, not the rock house. So if I have one criticism, it's like we should have stored the actual mech deck in the house made of stone, not the house made of wood. But the document burns. The document burns, and what happens is, here's another myth associated with the mech deck. People say, well, why wasn't there more said about it? Why weren't people discussing it like crazy? And if you understand the Declaration of Independence, nobody really talked about and elevated the Declaration of Independence until, as a country, we could sort of exhale after the War of 1812, and people understood, oh my gosh, this experiment, this crazy experiment of democracy is actually, it's going to work. And so until then, no one had really discussed or debated the Declaration of Independence or the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence until about 1812, 1815. And then what happens is, when people, this is just like any other committee, when things go well, all of a sudden everybody wants credit for it. And what happens is, Virginia and Thomas Jefferson and his cronies, they sort of scramble to try and take credit for everything. They want to take credit for the Declaration. They want to take credit for fighting the entire war, for all the, for everything. And the people of North Carolina there was a debate in the halls of Congress, and the representatives from North Carolina raised their hand and said, hello, we declared independence 14 months before Thomas Jefferson even put pen to paper. And then the controversy and the debate begins, and both sides sort of dig in. And what happens is, around this time, Jefferson's biographer, a man by the name of George Tucker, he's already written one volume of Jefferson's biography, and he wants to set out to write a second volume. But the first thing he wants to do is he wants to put to rest the claims that Jefferson plagiarized his Declaration of Independence, which is going to be really hard to do when you understand that George Mason really is the one who wrote Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, and Jefferson changed maybe a comma in one word. And here's the problem, as a side note, Jefferson was never tasked with coming up with an original document. By July of 1776, we were at risk of losing the war before we had even officially declared independence. And so he was tasked with, hurry up and get this paperwork done so we have something to sign so that it'll be official. And that's why it was created so quickly. And he was tasked with synthesizing the sentiments and the language of the day into a document that would express where America was, the colonies were at that moment. if Jefferson had always sort of, and this is one of the reasons why John Adams was always so irked about it. If Jefferson had always just said, yes, I did what I was asked to do. I synthesized all these different documents, the Constitution of Virginia, John Locke's philosophies, George Mason, he lifted heavily from George Mason. And the MEC deck had been in Philadelphia for a year. So I think it's pretty clear that the MEC deck had been circulating as well, which is why there are similar parts of the document. Sorry. There are 5 sections of the Mecklenburg Declaration and the Thomas Jefferson's Declaration that Jefferson's own biographer, George Tucker, said cannot be a coincidence. Either Jefferson stole from Charlotte or Charlotte stole from Jefferson, but these are too similar to be a coincidence. And so before George Tucker decides to write his second biography, he wants to prove that Jefferson didn't plagiarize the MEC deck. So he reaches out to Andrew Stevenson, who was the ambassador, was the American ambassador in London. And he asks him, and a fellow Jefferson crony. And he asked Jefferson, and I should say by this time, for years, back and forth, Virginia and North Carolina are going back and forth with each other about who declared first, who was more worthy. That language is also very choice. I believe it was another minister who recommended building a wall between Virginia and North Carolina. And he also said if somebody steps over that wall and disparages the MEC deck, that I forget, it was something to the effect of he would punch him in the nose. So if the priests are saying that, you can imagine what the rest of the county is saying. So Tucker reaches out to a Jefferson crony to use his credentials to get into the British National Archives to look up what is called Dispatch 34, which would be the most irrefutable proof of the MEC deck or of the MEC deck not being true. Dispatch 34 is part of the letters from the last royal governor of North Carolina. His name was Josiah Martin, and he wrote so many letters to the king asking for help, asking for munition, for soldiers, for help, because he kept saying, North Carolina is already in open rebellion. I need help. I need soldiers. I need money. And one of his last ditches, he wrote so many letters, they just started numbering them. So when he got to 34, he said, I will send your highness actual proof of what I'm dealing with. Enclosed is a copy of the Cape Fear Mercury, which has printed the Declaration of Independence that the crazy guys in Charlotte have already declared. So Dispatch 34 has the letter from Josiah Martin with the Cape Fear Mercury that contains the MEC deck attached. George Tucker asks Stevenson to use his credentials to get into the British National Archives to find this proof and then make it public that Jefferson did not plagiarize the MEC deck. So it sat there for centuries, literally centuries. And people have always looked for it because it's sort of the Rosetta Stone of the MEC deck. It would be irrefutable, another piece of the irrefutable proof. So one day in the middle of the book, and this is another one of my favorite passages, my wife understood that I was obsessed. I was going to remain obsessed until the book got done. And so I texted her, I said, and this text exchange is in the book, I think I need to go to London. And she said, is this for the MEC deck? And I said, yep. And she said, will you use frequent flyer miles? And I said, yep. And then her last text was, cheerio then, have a great time. So I ended up getting access to the British Archives, and then a folder that contained all the dispatches from Josiah Martin. So here I am in the British National Archives. I've already gone through all the hoops. I've got my gloves on. you have to be escorted for some of these documents. And someone's over your shoulder, an archivist is over your shoulder, and I'm going through these documents, looking for the dispatch 34. It gets to the end of the day, they're flicking the lights, which is what they do when you're past time and you need to leave. And I haven't found it yet. And this is a similar Lila moment where it's like, well, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a phony. I should give up. This is a bad idea. And so I take the folder of all the dispatches, and it's a big blue cardboard folder to protect these. And I close it like this. And then as I hand it back to the archivist, I turn it over to make sure nothing falls out. And as I hand it back to the archivist, there's a little index card stapled to the back of this. And at the very last second, as the archivist is turning to take this back into like the giant airlocked archives for all eternity, I say, does that card mean anything? And she tears it off and she says, and I won't do a British accent, but she had seen me struggling all day long. And she said, this is a code that says there's additional information on some of these files. If you take it to the computer terminal across the research desk across the archives, they will look it up for you and show you what's in it. And she said, but you need to be quick because we're already closed and you're the last person in the actual British National Archives. So I run, I'm like jumping over trash cans and desks, and people are, weaving through people. And I get to the terminal, and I remember this so distinctly because I didn't even take the time to pull the chair out. I just leaned over the chair and typed in the code, and up came dispatch 34. And I had basically memorized, because it's another great, it's just one of those things where the history comes alive because Josiah Martin is desperate for help, and he's begging the king and the Earl of Dartmouth, who was sort of the Secretary of State, for resources. So I get to it. I know what the dispatch 34 says. What I want is the newspaper that's supposed to be attached that he references in this dispatch. So I get to the end and it's not there. And same thing, I go to the last page and turn it over, and there's a handwritten note from an archivist in 1840 something that notes the Cape Fear Mercury attached to dispatch 34 was taken out by Andrew Stevenson and not returned. And again, very much like Lila and learning about Alexander Craighead, that's when I said, aha, there's something to this Mekdek story and the controversy and the fact that a Jefferson crony destroyed the best evidence we've had of the Mekdek. And there you go. And I should have warned Judy, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit long. I tend to ramble. I get a little bit excited. I am a history nerd, but so we've gone a bit long, but I will stay as long as you guys like to discuss or ask questions or whatever you'd like. So, excellent. This one? Okay. Thank you. I can also, I can repeat it too. If you.
Were there any repercussions during those months from the people in Mecklenburg County from the British government for declaring freedom?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So the subcommittee writes up the declaration. They agree, they unanimously agree, everyone signs it. Thomas Polk then declares it from the courthouse steps at Trade and Tryon in Charlotte. And then I'll tell you a quick side note. the first act of independence everyone did was, and there are 3 or 4 different eyewitnesses to this. This is one of my favorite parts of the story. Everyone gets excited and throws their hats in the air, and most of the hats land on the courthouse roof. And so the first Americans to be actually free and independent from England spent the first few hours of their freedom trying to get their hats off the courthouse roof. The next day, there is sort of a mech deck hangover. And I think they all go, oh my God, what did we do? But we're independent now. And they decide to find a volunteer, Captain James Jack, to ride 4 copies of the mech deck up to the Continental Congress. And what happens is the representatives from North Carolina especially were all loyalists. And Jefferson even mentions this in his letters back to John Adams. And so they take receipt of the mech deck and they suppress it and they don't share it. Number one, because they were waiting to hear back. They had just sent the olive branch resolution to the king, which was a last ditch effort to try and say, we don't want war. We love you. We're your loyal subjects. We don't want to fight. We don't want bloodshed. And so imagine they're waiting to hear back. And then this document shows up that says, from North Carolina, it says, we're already independent. So the document was suppressed, ironically, tragically, by our own representatives. And so England never really understood or knew about it other than just sort of the rumors. But at that time, if you know anything about the regulators, the region, the entire region was in open rebellion already. So there wasn't any repercussions. And one of the things that makes Captain Jack's journey so brave is that if he had been caught, if any of them had been caught, they would have been hung for treason against the king. But none of that ever came about. Hi. Yes. Oh, this is my favorite part of the, so she wants to know about the connection between Thomas Pratt and Thomas Spratt and Thomas Polk. And again, another one of my favorite parts of this story, and is that Thomas Polk, who basically carved Charlotte out of the wilderness through his leadership and with his bare hands, and then led the men who ended up declaring independence. The entire reason for him to come to Charlotte, to Carolina, was he was madly in love with Susanna Spratt, and he followed her family. Thomas Polk was set up as a surveyor in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And when he found out that Susanna, the love of his life, was leaving, he followed the Spratts all the way down to Charlotte. They ended up marrying. I think they had, I think they had 10 children. And they're buried together 500 feet from where Thomas Polk set his backpack down in Charlotte. So I love that there's a love story behind the whole origin of Charlotte, of the mech deck, of all of that. And then the other story that I really like is Thomas Spratt, the father, right? He was the first European settler to come across the Yadkin River on by wagon in history. He also enjoyed the McNitt Alexander's whiskey and brandy, and celebrated so much after the mech deck was declared that they went to him to become an eyewitness, but he couldn't remember anything from that day. So you got the good, it's like every family, you've got the good and the bad. But thank you, that was a great question.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. Two sort of linked questions. It seems as if since there's no original left, but there is a known text, it seemed that the video suggested there's some unclarity as to what the text actually is, but do we more or less know exactly what the text said? And then secondly, sort of linked, did the mech deck's signers and writers specifically say this is for all of the colonies? Or were they just speaking for their own community? Like, who were they representing when they did that?
Yeah. Great question. So yes, and I should have mentioned this. McNitt Alexander was and we'll have to talk about this, but some people in your family call him McKnight and some call him McNitt. Which do you prefer? McNitt. Okay. All right. So I got it right. But McNitt Alexander was the secretary of the convention where they drafted and declared and signed the MECDEC. His original meeting notes from that meeting, which is puts the whole day in context, talks about what's happening and the rider arriving from Massachusetts, and a rough outline of the passages of what the MECDEC was going to say. Those notes survived and are in the archives, they're in the archives in Wilson Library in Chapel Hill, and you can still hold them in your hands to this day. And I say this in the book, that if that was the only documentation that survived, it would be more than enough to prove the MECDEC's authenticity. On top of that, there are copies that they're not. There are two sets of copies of the original document. One is called the Davy copy, and then there's another copy that is typically referred to as the copy in the unknown hand, which I believe is a copy that was written by Thomas Polk's son before the fire. They can't, I think to authenticate or to date, I think they can only get within like 20 to 30 years, I think, by testing the paper. But that handwriting is very similar to other stuff written by Thomas Polk's son. And so it's my contention, and there are people who dispute this, that is a copy of the original. Let's see. And then your second question, sorry. Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah, very good. I think that their intention was it's just Mecklenburg County, because they were each militia captains inside Mecklenburg County. And so I think the language doesn't say only us, but I think it's implied that it's like, as far as the crown is concerned, Mecklenburg is now free and independent. And then what's interesting is then days later, and this document, the original document, survived, they then wrote up something called the Mecklenburg Resolves. And this sort of answers your question. So it must have been intent. The resolves were a list of things, how they were going to self-govern until the rest of the country caught up and was also independent. And the resolves, I think, also prove you wouldn't need a new list of rules and guidelines as to how to rule yourself when you're independent, unless you've declared independence. So yeah, but I should also point out too, I think this is a good opportunity, and this is part of the MECDEC story as well, that the men who did this, while there were some variation in their class status, and the class system had not really reached the frontier yet, quite like it was in Virginia or Pennsylvania. Those men, they were all white male landowners. So it's important to point out that this first declaration was not meant for women, for Black people, or for men who didn't own land. And that's also a part of the MECDEC. Yes. Yeah, the controversy, I think, oh, when the date on the state flag was added, and if there's controversy associated with that. And I don't know, I don't know the exact date but I feel like it goes back, I mean, centuries. I don't know, I can't say if I should know this, if it goes all the way back to the original design for the flag. The controversy is the original second date was May 20th. North Carolina seceded from the Union purposefully on May 20th. And so the second date was that date. And And that has been removed and replaced with, I think, the date of the Halifax Resolves, which was another declaration. And so they didn't do themselves any favors by choosing May 20th, because I do think part of the backlash against the MECDEC and part of the sort of effort to sort of deny North Carolina its place in history, and is, if you look at the timeline of things and when the sort of the misinformation begins, there is part of it was punishment for you, since you have, because of the Civil War, since you've declared war against your own country, you lose claim to original patriotism. And that's a whole nother book and debate, but that was a big part of, since you declared on May 20th and you're so proud of it, we're going to deny your original patriotism as well. Hmm? Yes. I can't get away from the controversies. Yeah, I need to just write a simple, straightforward book. Thank you for mentioning it. So Judy, is that, so I get to come back next summer? Is that what you're saying?
Judy, while I've got a captive audience here, I'm just going to put a plug in for the Presbyterian Heritage Center. If you haven't come to visit us this summer, we have the most amazing exhibit on Hurricane Helene. We have video that Priscilla Hayner did for us. We've got lots of pictures. We've got quotes. We have sticky notes that you can write your thoughts if you were here during that time. If you just want to say something about the exhibit or that time in Montreat history, please come see us. You will not regret it. We've had just a stampede through there of visitors and Montreaters coming to see it. So if you haven't seen it, please come visit us. I think you'll really enjoy it and really understand that Montreat was in a mess last year, but we've come a long way.
People out of town have figured all of this out. I've had out of town companies the last 4 years, and people in each one of those out of town groups have said want to go to the Heritage Center and watch the movie, which Priscilla Fleming said during a play. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, good, good. Of course.